welcome back. Well, we're busy doing the prep for our summer season. An East Coast venue holds about 1,400 people, and every year we stick a PA system in around about this time of year, and it runs through till probably the end of October when the place gets shut up again. And I thought you might be interested in what we're sticking in, because it's not particularly common in the UK, and indeed in the parts of the world that it is better known, it seems to have a bit of a bad reputation. And I guess what I'm not talking about is line array PAs. Now, it might seem a bit strange to start a video off and say what we're not going to talk about, but the history of me is that I tend to research as well as I can, and then I make a decision based on my knowledge and my own preferences, which sometimes means I go for things that are not flavour of the month. Video wise, although I've got DSLRs, I don't shoot video on them. I just don't like shooting video on DSLRs, so I'm using traditional studio type cameras. And I'm happy with that. I don't follow the trend unless it's going to advantage me in some way. And looking back at the history of PA systems in theatres, which is where we mainly work, is that back in the 70s, we started out with line arrays. Well, it was one box with a load of speakers in it. It had the Shure brand on the front. But the Shure Vocal Master columns that we had back then were a line array. Now, the line array science is quite clever when you look at it and you research it quite carefully. And it revolves around multiple drive units and having a common wavefront. The physics is easily available on the net. The problem seems to be that it gets a bit bent by people who've got preferences, likes and dislikes, and things change. So if we think about that Shure Vocal Master PA system, early to mid 70s, it was a line array. Had a number of drive units in a tall box, and the thing about line arrays is when they work in that mode, it means that the coverage is quite narrow that way, but it's quite wide that way. Ideal for theatres, ideal for anywhere where you've got an audience spread out in seating, but they don't go up or down very much. So that's the thoughts behind line arrays. I mean, they were very, very popular in churches. I mean, UK churches have got dreadful acoustics for speech, and people would slap line array columns up on every single column that they could mount them to, and discover that it was a complete mess, because of course that wonderful wide coverage hits everybody at slightly different times because they're hearing it from multiple sources. So line arrays sort of got a bit of a bad rep. And then of course we started to phase line arrays out. The line arrays, the tall thin boxes, vanished, and overnight we had a 12 or a 15-inch driver with a horn mounted above it, and that became our new go-to PA. Now, my own suspicions are it's because they could be louder. Most of the loudspeakers that were in those line arrays were not particularly powerful, and the total power fed to the entire unit was quite low. I mean, 100 watts was considered an awful lot. I remember doing a Slade concert in the 70s. So it's a Slade British rock band, and they'd actually got two 4x12-inch WEM cabinets either side of the stage, and each one had a 100 watt amp. So that was actually sort of wow. So we had 100 watts going to each one of these 4x12-inch WEM cabinets that did sound, to be perfectly honest, a bit dreadful, but at the time, wow, it was loud. So we moved away from line arrays, and then we drifted into those sort of boxes on sticks that have remained popular for years. And strange things started to happen when people tried to use multiple boxes like that. And there were nasty phase effects where the beam of one would start to fall off and the beam of the one next door started to creep in. And if you happened to be sitting on the line between one and the other, it was a little bit strange, a slightly hollow sound, I suppose is the only way I can really describe it. But the phase problems were definitely there when people attempted to try and increase power or increase coverage. Quite a few of the speakers were designed in that trapezoid shape. So instead of being a square box with 90-degree corners, they all tilted in. So you could actually put two together. And the quest seemed to be to get them as close to each other as possible to try and avoid the effect of multiple drivers, which, fair enough, is not too much of a problem with the low frequency energy, but the HF drivers could be quite potent. And when they start to sort of have phase issues, it can be sort of move your head a little bit and weird things happen. Volume suddenly shoots up or shoots down. Very strange. Then line arrays suddenly had a resurgence. So all of a sudden we've got line arrays coming out of our ears. Boxes and boxes and boxes of them. And we're still using them in the big arenas and things like that. Now, I didn't go down that path. I carried on. I was very happy with an EAW box that I used for my band. The EAW box had got two nice 15-inch drivers, a mid-range unit and then an HF unit at the top. And it was in one box, it was easy to move about, and although it wasn't too wide, it was not too high either. So the coverage from that was sort of broadly even, and you could just put them on at the front of the stage, you could point them where you wanted the sound to go, and they sort of worked. And EAW's sort of cleverness was inside the box. It didn't rely on me having to adjust things. Now, line arrays, of course, then start to creep in with all sorts of little adjustment brackets so that you can actually tinker with that line at the front. So the wavefront in a perfect line, which does the job it's supposed to do, starts to get adjusted a little bit so that you can hang them up, and then the bottom cabinets could be tilted progressively down to cover the front rows. That seemed to be the way that the market was moving, and that's where all the new line arrays were pointed. So my band flew out to Portugal to do a corporate job on the beach. All we took with us were keys, guitars, everything else was provided. So they provided all the backline, they were going to provide the PA, and it was on the beach, and it was probably 90 minutes worth of a corporate event, and we figured that the people at the other end were perfectly capable of choosing something that would work in that circumstance. So we didn't pay too much attention to it. And when we arrived, we saw some strange looking boxes and wondered what on earth they were. It turned out they were JBL VRXs. And I really liked them. I liked the sound, I liked the fact that they were quite small, and I liked the fact that you could use them in singles, you could stack 2 or 3 together, you could fly them, so you could actually drop them from the ceiling, or you could put them on top of the sub and you could put them going up. For seating that was tiered, it meant that you could put a sub on the floor and then stick the tops on it, which progressively got harder. They're not a line array because the JBL VRX has predetermined angles and they fasten together. You cannot adjust them. So they're actually a curved system. There is no way you can align those into a traditional line array. And because they're neither one thing or the other, people seem to hate them. But after the gig, I was impressed enough that I decided to try and source some for my summer theatre. The reason being, flying those would be exactly what I needed. The JBLs have a neat little system on the back with some switches, and you can adjust the power of the HF unit, which is mounted to one side. So you can dial in 3 dB gain, and you can use that box to aim at the rear of the audience. You can then set the next one to 0 dB, and that will handle the next portion of the audience, and then the one that's nearest the front you set to -3 dB, and that'll handle the front ones. So it effectively changes the reach of your PA. So if you're sitting at the back, you've actually got a louder loudspeaker pointing towards you than if you were sitting on the first few rows, where you've actually got the same unit, but it's set to deliver lower power at the HF end. It doesn't adjust the bottom end at all. The bottom end stays the same. So once we creep up the range and we creep into the sort of treble section that's coming out of the horn, you've got 3 different levels. I mean, the science is pretty clever, and quite a lot of people poo-pooed it and said how terrible it was and it was going to introduce all sorts of phase errors. And then if you look on the net, you'll discover a few people have actually tested them, discovered, oh, it actually works. It really does actually do what it says on the box. So I bought a system. The system took me quite a long while to get together, because I actually wanted 8 boxes and I wanted 4 of the subs. That was mainly to go in my summer theatre where we put the PA, because the ceiling height is quite low, but we've got 35 odd seats wide and it goes back nearly 30 rows. So there's a total capacity, I think, of something in the region of 1,400 seats. But it's like a big barn and it's not high. So we've always had real problems trying to get volume at the back. The size of the venue also meant that delays were a bit of a problem, because you'd hear too many loudspeakers. So finding the right settings for a delay would only work for a cluster of seats, and trying to do it for everyone was just a nightmare. So speakers only at the front made sense. But of course that left the back seriously quiet, certainly at the HF end. So we had a bit of a problem. The JBL VRXs sorted it. I'm really pleased I got them. Getting them was a different matter, because they're not a new speaker. They've been around now for 15, 16 years, I think. And most dealers never sold very many of them. So they would all have to be supplied direct from JBL. And I bought them just before COVID started. And it was quite difficult to actually lay my hands on them. So what I did was I hunted abroad. I managed to get a couple from the UK. I got some from Europe, and I even got 1 pair from Mexico. So they were truly a worldwide product, and I got them all shipped here. So some of them were cheaper than others, but a lot of dealers were quite happy to give me a really good price just to clear their stock. I found people who'd had them in stock as demo units and things like that. So I think one of them was a B stock item because it had got a mark on it, you know, that sort of thing. But I managed to lay my hands on the 8 tops and the 4 subs. Just took a while. I also went for the non-powered version. Now, pretty much with PAs now, the trend is to put the amps in the speakers. And I didn't want to do that, mainly because I already had piles of amplifiers from previous systems. And they weren't going to be trucked about, so having nice big heavy amplifiers was no bother to me, because they're not going to move. They probably live in that venue and stay put. I've got a smaller rack that I can use of lighter sort of Class D type amps, but the majority of the ones with the big transformers are sitting in the venue and there's plenty of power available there. So it just made sense to take out the EAW speakers, which were bi-amped, and replace them with lots of the JBL VRX. And looking at the software that JBL will let you have, it looked like it would be ideal to fly 3 and a sub either side of the stage, and then use a further 2 on the floor, sort of as front fills, but really cross fills would be a better description. So put the other sub either side on the floor and then aim them across just so they covered the front. I did have an option, of course, to put front fills on the edge of the stage pointing at the audience, but we do an awful lot of one-nighters, and very often the one-nighter people bring in all their gear, and we would have had to keep striking them and then putting them out, striking them, put them out, and sometimes there would just physically wouldn't have been space for the front fills. So I took the compromise route and had the front weaker area where there was no direct coverage sorted just by a pair of the 932s facing in. So that's the history, and we're now prepping the things, and I've got flight cases galore here which we're trying to get out to the venue in the next few days, and then we'll do the connecting and the testing and the commissioning sometime in the next couple of weeks, and I'll do some video while we're there so you can get an idea of what that theatre looks like. But anyway, that's these. I'll take one out of the box and you can have a look. This is what a JBL VRX 932 actually looks like. So we've got 12-inch driver at this side, and then in this slot here there are 3 HF horns. So they're actually arranged so that one points slightly up, one points horizontal, one points slightly down, and the waveguide on here ensures pretty even distribution left to right. The units are also fitted with built-in flyware. So what we have here, if I just pull the pin out, that just flips up. We can then attach another speaker on the top. The pins will go back in, and it's a really simple and quick way of getting them up. And in the theatre, what we tend to do is hang them, so we've actually got them at ground level with a mounting frame. The mounting frame holds the weight of the speakers on this one and the one on the other side. We then lift it up a little bit, add the next one, lift it up a little bit, add the next one. The subs use exactly the same spacing, and they use exactly the same mounting kit. So you can actually fit these with the subs on top. In actual fact, the way that I use them is we hang the sub first. So there's an 18-inch sub, we hang that, and we then hang 3 of these off the bottom of the sub. Equally, you could put the sub on the floor and you could put these on top of the sub. The mounting is exactly the same. Now, on the back, what we've actually got is a biamp switch. So if you want to, you can run them in standard passive mode, where one input on circuits 1 and 2 on there will feed using the internal crossover. So they're a one-stop shop really. Feed them with audio from an amplifier. What comes out the front is great. That's my way of looking at it. Or if you want to, switch that across there, and then you can actually feed in a separate feed to the HS section and a separate feed to the LS section. Originally I was going to use that, but discovered that in actual fact the crossover seems to have very little effect on the sound, so I'm quite happy to use them in passive mode and feed them both using the internal crossover. Now the other nice thing about that is, of course, it means that I can make up combined cables. So if I'm using 4-core cable to supply the speakers, I've got a splitter, so I can send the sub and the top down the same cable, which actually works quite nicely for me. The 2 switches here work the power of the top HF unit. So you stick a little screwdriver in the slot, you can slide them all across the left and you'll get the -3 dB. Then there's a position to give you 0, and then another position that will give you the 3 dB gain on the top. It just adjusts some resistors in the crossover. It's not particularly clever. There's no sort of ultimate cleverness to it. It just adjusts the power of the 3 tweeters. It seems to work extremely well. I can't argue with that at all. But they're not light loudspeakers, and when you actually manage to get 3 of these and a sub, it does mean serious chain to get it up there. But we're okay for those, so it's not too much of a bother. There's no cleverness inside the cabinet. It is just an empty box. There's some barriers where the horn assembly goes in. In actual fact, if you take a couple of bolts out the back, you can just pull the horn assembly completely out. You've got a crossover at the back, and a 12-inch driver mounted in here. And they're those strange JBL drivers where the aluminium is quite big and chunky, so I'm guessing it works as a heatsink. But essentially that's how they work. Well, welcome to the theatre, and I've just completed the get-in of all the gear, and we're going to try and get some JBL VRX hung up this morning. It's a nice sunny day outside, and I'm inside the building almost in complete darkness. I've managed to rig up a couple of lights so I can see what I'm doing, because the power supply is turned off to a large part of the building, so I'm a bit stuck. But I've rigged some lights up, so we'll have a look and see what we've got. So this is the view from behind the light. That's actually what I've got to actually do the work this morning. So it's not ideal, but it's actually a nice light. It'll do the trick. You'll probably see in the picture what we've got are some cases with, we've got 8 VRX 932s in there. They're the passive versions because we've got plenty of amps, and then there's a pile of subs down there. So the job this morning is to take the stuff in there and eventually have it up there. And I'm on my own, and that's one of the advantages of this system, is that one person, even a decrepit old idiot like me, can actually manage to do the job on my own. So, as you can see in this image, the middle one is labelled mid-right, which is lucky because that is the mid-right. The bottom right is right, that's good. The one at the top says bottom left. So obviously that's one that should really have been on the other side. So I think I'm just going to swap the labels around. I've already adjusted these switches. This one's set to 0, +3 on that, -3 on that one. And this side's now hanging. For those people that have seen a bit of this sort of stuff before, you might notice that it's obviously on the wonk, good British term, but hanging from the ceiling at a predetermined height is another shackle. So once it gets up to operating height, the back shackle gets added to the shackle on the frame, and by lowering then the front one, we get a balanced horizontal for the sub at the top. So we're now up on this one. That's done, and now we've just got to do the ones on the other side, which is a job for after a cup of tea, I believe. Well, there we go. So that's the job done for today. I need somebody else to go up the top and level them off. So I've got them hung. They only need now hoisting up, and we're sorted. It gives us a couple of spares. We're probably going to rig those as side fills. One of the big problems is that normally you would stick speakers along the front edge of the stage as front fills, but as this venue has sort of a whole sequence over the summer of one-nighters, most of them bring all their own gear in, and so there's no real way to have a set of speakers along there that are permanent. So what we'll do is put that sub that's on the floor there, probably where that flight case is, and then sit the one of those top boxes and angle them 45 degrees across, and that'll just give a bit of coverage in the middle. That worked quite nicely last year. Front fills would be ideal, but that's just not practical. So that's how it's going to work, and I've got it all done and I haven't managed to damage anything, or myself, which is quite nice. And so it's just a case of get those up there. That shouldn't be too much of a job. The cables are actually on the wall already in. I didn't bother to take those out, so it should just be a case of plugging them in, and somewhere in that pile of flight cases over there is a couple of amp racks, and they live in the orchestra pit, which is covered up permanently here. So there we go. That's where we are, the Britannia Theatre, and the summer is fast approaching. So that's a quick look at the JBL VRX 932, which I really like. If you look on the net, you'll find all sorts of people telling you how horrible they are. Well, I suspect that those people may not have spent the time using them and listening to them and tweaking them. I tend to find that I don't need huge amounts of corrective EQ. What comes straight out of the mixer goes into here, and it's bright, but that's easily controllable if you don't want it to be bright. But I don't find I have to put any strange EQ curves or anything like that in it. Just run them and they're fine. The subs are rather nice too, because they're exactly the same sort of design, just a square box with an 18-inch sub and a couple of ports, so they're not particularly exciting. But physically they're quite compact and they kick a lot of air about. See you later. The venue itself holds 1,400 people. I'm not quite sure what you can see in the low light, but it's a massive barn of a place. So it's 1,400 seats all on one level, and then we have in the middle quite a deep stage So the snag we have with this particular venue is that the ceiling height is quite restricted. Now at the front, you can see there where the chain's hanging down from the two suspension points, but it's not a huge height from the floor to the ceiling. In actual fact, with a 6 metre odd ladder standing on top of that, you can touch the ceiling. But we carry on right to the very back, you'll see the problem. Now in the middle, where that ladder goes up to, we have a follow spot box which hangs from the ceiling. Now that's about halfway back, and as you can see, it gets in the way of everything. So, walking backwards, this is the rear row of seats. So that's quite a way. So we've got 1,400 and a few seats in here. But at the back, you can see that the ceiling is incredibly low. Now historically, the problem here has been that any form of centre flying is impossible because that follows what box dangling down from the roof gets in the way. So we're either left with ground stacking, which blasts the heads off the people in the first few rows, and for visiting people, flying is pretty much out of the question because a lot of the roof is out of bounds to anybody other than us. The building is actually made of asbestos panels. It's perfectly safe, but when it was built in 1958, the rules are somewhat different. So in 1958, asbestos panels were great. Every single one of these panels is painted and sealed and labelled. They can't be disturbed. Things like that hanging down box where new fire exit signs and things like that are fitted, they have to be fitted onto the existing woodwork. They can't be fitted anything to the asbestos panels. There's no way that anybody's allowed to make a hole in anything. So running cables through to a flown array is a pretty long job. It's not practical for visiting people to use that sort of system. Now, it's always meant for us a very high ground stack, and the people at the front suffer from the volume. The people at the back have quite modest volumes. Doesn't suit. And one of the big deals is that the sound position for visiting people is here. So they actually get this space here, which is big enough. I mean, we used to use it when we had the huge format analogue desks were coming in. That was absolutely fine. And the house control room is in there, so which is mostly open. But of course, lots of people don't want to mix from here for quite obvious reasons. Although the sound here, in actual fact, can be quite nice if you've got a left and a right array and nothing in the middle. But the big snag is it's a long way, so the levels from a front rig tend to be excessive at the front and modest at the back. As a consequence, people turn the volume up here, so it's nice and loud, and the people at the front ears bleed. Well, not quite, but it often gets very close to that. Now, this isn't actually a new problem. They've known about this sort of long depth ever since the building was built. And in the 70s, they actually tried to do something about it. And there was a line array, not the sort of line array you imagine, but one of those. That's a Shure vocal master column, and it's a line array. It's a load of speakers in a row. It was mounted there to give extra volume to the back, and of course back in the days that was put in there, there were no such thing as delays, and it ended up making the sound extremely messy. But it was appreciated that there was a problem back in the late 70s and early 80s, and that was their attempt to sort it. So this is what we're left with. Now the solution for us, of course, is to mount not a line array, but a constant curvature array. And the JBL is very good for long, medium and short throws from one curved pack. So in here, the units that will be at the top have their HF set to the 3dB plus setting, the ones in the middle on the normal setting, and the ones that only have to do the jump from where the suspension piece is there, from that frame to the front row, they get on the -3 dB setting. And last year, for the first time, we proved that actually worked, and we had the best sound we've had, I think, probably forever.